This video is about how to interview for a job. Of course, it's one of the most important skill sets that you can have. And besides your skills in actual journalism, it's probably the most important skill overall because so many parts of it are universal. So, the first thing to do is something you've probably already done, and that, of course, is to research the station. And you probably did this as you were writing your cover letter. And it's a great thing to continue to do so you are following the news in that market leading up to the actual interview. This way, you can ask questions about the stories that you're watching. For example, asking if there are any new developments in the crime story, or what the reaction has been to the investigation that just aired, or complimenting the station on something it did well. So by now, it's obvious that this video is all about what to do and what to say when you are across the desk from the news director. And the first thing is to know what's on your tape. And I know, this seems obvious, but news directors have told me time and time again that they have asked questions about stories on people's reels, and the person didn't know. So, be prepared to not only talk about your tape, but also why you selected those stories. That question will probably come up, and that's the question news directors are telling me the reporters and anchors they're interviewing can't answer. So please, know what you're putting on your tape and why. It's definitely being able to explain why that most people forget. And make sure that you have a better answer than, hey, it was the best thing I had. Of course it's the best work you have, that's why it's on your tape. So with that, try to remember the production of the piece, the behind the scenes of what happened that day. Now, with that, not the gossip of the day, just what it took to get it to air. How hard did you have to pitch the story to actually be able to do the story? Did you fight to do it? And then in terms of what you had to do on the ground, in the field, what did you have to do to get the story on the air? Because maybe your deadline was tight, or maybe there was really good content and you knew what to do with that, so you had to budget your day in a specific way to figure out how to get the best story on the air under deadline. So, with all of this, keep in mind too that the news director might have asked for a second tape. So, be prepared to talk about whatever second tape or second reel that you happen to give them. And I know, at this point you're thinking, do you know how long it took to get good enough content for the first tape? Yeah, I do. Probably a year and a half, or at least the last year. And now the news director wants a second one in their inbox with all new content by next week. And by next week, you're lucky if that's the deadline you get. Because sometimes you get, and we'll talk about this further down, they'll say, give me your stories from the next 3 days. So, here's why they do that. News directors do this because they know that you have self-selected the best live shots, stand-ups, and packages. So, they're naturally curious, how much of that effort and skill do you put in to your everyday work? News directors typically ask for a second tape during the phone interview stage, though I have heard of it after the in-person interview stage. And the ask will simply go like this. Please send me a second tape in a week with 3 of the stories that you put on air this past week. And again, if you get to pick and choose from the next 5 days, that's lucky. And this is exactly what the news director in Memphis asked me to do. And I got really lucky that this house fire happened to happen during that window of time he asked for. And it's weird from our point of view to associate some emotional relief with something so horrible. It's just, that's what this job, unfortunately, sometimes is. But it's a good story, and especially the better story is the story behind how that was actually produced. And that story I tell you in a later video. And in terms of what that Memphis news director thought, he loved both the actual story and what it took, and of course the behind the scenes of not only what I had to do on the ground, but also how I convinced the producer to even take the package. And I know that seems strange. You're watching this. Why would a producer not advocate for it? But again, in that later video, I break down to you that 3 to 4 hours. And keep in mind, again, the news director may say, just give me your next 3 stories. So if you're going back to work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, just send me those 3. This doesn't always happen, but it sometimes can. Now let's talk about going after breaking news or the lead story. So outside of your tapes, be ready to talk about how you break news in your market and go after the lead story every day, every night. And I know, it sounds cliche, but news directors want fighters who are going to claw their way to a big story. And by big story, the biggest one. So to them, that attitude translates into that if they're fighting for the story, they're fighting for the viewer. In addition to all of this, be ready to talk about how you put people in your stories and tell stories through those real people. They'll be expecting this, and some news directors even say that that sounds cliche now, but the reason why you're doing it is if your tape can back up that you actually do this, and you do it well, meaning when I watch or they watch your reel, that your packages make me feel something. There is some level of craftsmanship to it, that it's not just slapped together for air. You'll come off as actually being a professional that just doesn't know what to say in the room with that news director, but has the tape to back it up. By being able to back up what it is you're actually saying, signals to the news director that you're a professional and a self-starting professional. Because to do something with some level of craftsmanship, it's going to take a lot of motivation in the field and that fighter mentality that they're looking for. So with that, the distinction here is this is very different than somebody else interviewing with them saying that they believe in people stories and stories are all about people. That's the cliche part that will turn off the news director, because they only want stories making air about people. They don't want people in suits or official sound or anybody that's going to turn the viewer off. So again, by having a tape with these examples, having the behind the scenes story of what it took to actually get that to air, that is what's going to make you different. And to be honest, you probably already do some of this, because if it was just officials on your tape, you wouldn't have been flown out for the interview, let alone actually ever gotten a phone interview. So again, this is all to tell them that you understand the audience and are again fighting for the viewer. And now, they may also ask you what the biggest news or biggest long-term stories are going on in your market right now. Now, they're not going to fact check this on their own, but they want to hear from you, because what they're really asking about is, well, do they know how to follow a story and the process stories that come in day 3 and day 4 after the breaking and spot news aspects of that are over. So can they take a story from breaking news to all sorts of developments the next week after, or perhaps with some of these, the months after? And they also want to know too, are you keeping up with the variety of news in your market? What's going on in crime, in politics, or in terms of, again, fighting for the viewer? Are there viewer problems that you have helped solve? Is there anything consumer related that you have helped solve? Those are some of the things that they're hoping that you talk about. Now, if you don't have those things to talk about, that's okay. But again, start pulling from what you do know and go from there. And now, one very important lesson in all of this is to know that what you take into the room, meaning your attitude, and of course the stories, can be your enemy. And here's how. This is all another way of saying that you can be your biggest problem in the interview. But this is simple to overcome. So let's start with the obvious example, a bad attitude. If you're in the interview and while you're answering some of these questions, all you're doing is you're complaining about your boss or your news managers or your coworkers, the boss will assume that you'll do that too if you're hired there, and they're not looking to hire someone like that. So the answer here is obvious as well. You want to go in with a constructive, resourceful attitude. Now, that doesn't mean be all sunshine and smiles, but you can be honest, just don't be negative. Plus, when giving answers in an interview, it's always a plus to have the attitude to always be looking for what's right instead of what's wrong. And this can be a challenge for journalists, because we're trained to look for immediately what's wrong or what's mismatching, what's not right in all of this, to be very critical. Sometimes we're labeled as cynical because we won't believe people or something at face value. We need proof, sometimes various levels of proof, and also too, proof from different people and different sources. So again, having a natural attitude in the interview process of trying to look at things on the brighter side or what is right before you constructively critique what could have been done better or an opportunity for improvement, that sometimes takes some practice with some people I've coached. And one more point about this. It's a great idea to have a story on how you constructively solved a problem in your newsroom or out in the field. That'll go a long way to communicating to them that you are a problem solver and not, of course, a problem starter. Every newsroom has plenty of those. Also be prepared to talk about what you bring to the station. This is the opportunity to talk about your strengths. And some people aren't comfortable with this. But please know, the boss is actually asking you and therefore giving you permission to actually talk about yourself. It's okay to do, and something that we're not trained to do in school or even at the collegiate level because we're told not to brag or don't take the sunshine from everybody else or don't take somebody else's shine. Things like that. In the job interview, talking about strengths, skills, what you bring to the job, a vision that you may have for the kind of reporting that you want to do, or for something you see with them online. If you see that there is a beat that they're not covering, or a way to do stories that they haven't done yet, you can pitch those, and that will make you be a very interesting candidate. My strengths were actually loving being a one-person band, and many people aren't, so that's one thing that made me stand out. Another strength was being a creative storyteller, which is a statement that was easily backed up by my resume tape. I also talked about how I was a creative problem solver in the field, no matter if it was solving a problem in my environment or one out of my control, like the weather, or working with a photographer on my live shot. I always found a solution. Also be ready to talk about your biggest weakness, and also what you're doing to actually work on it. I like to think of these as areas for improvement. That'll be impressive. Few actually talk about what they're doing to work on it. And that means that when you do that, it means that you're self-aware and driven enough to invest in making a weakness a strength of yours. And in the end, that's really what the boss is looking for: a good attitude and a growth mindset. You'll probably also be asked some version of the following question. Tell us about a time when you disagreed with a decision that your boss was making and what you did about it. Another version of this question is, tell us about a time when your boss told you to do something you disagreed with and what you did about it. The boss is asking this question to get an idea of how you are with conflict resolution. You may also be asked if you were ever asked by a manager or the boss to do something that you thought was unethical and what you did in that situation. Each boss has different ones that are important to them, but this gives you a healthy start. Also, please know, it's okay to pause before answering a question. In fact, this signals to the person that you are answering to that you're taking the question seriously, that you are listening. Now with that, some of your answers you may say quickly, and that's okay. Just know that it's okay to pause during the question where you might actually have to think a little bit. That's okay. Know that it projects confidence and experience when doing this. And that's it. That's what you need to know about interviewing. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'll see you in the next video.